Alex was just an ordinary college student living a life filled with classes, assignments and the occasional late-night study session. He was not particularly social, preferring to spend his evenings lost in books or playing video games. One day, while scrolling through his university's housing portal, he stumbled upon a listing that caught his eye. It was an ad looking for roommates, but not just any roommates. This listing welcomed extraterrestrial beings. At first he thought it was a joke. Who would want to live with an alien?
They called it the summit of continuancia, ceremonial echo of centuries past, when unions weren't about hearts, but strategy. The throne world of Lysith Prime shimmered under a sky engineered to reflect perfection, every cloud placed like brushstrokes on a living canvas. Inside the high hall, nobles cloaked in refracted starlight-filled rows of floating seats, their expressions honed sharp from politics, not poetry. Kaelara stepped forward without being called. She wore no ceremonial veil, no heirloom crest. Just the smooth silver of her skin, the braid of her ancestry knotted behind her neck like a question no one had dared ask. The queen's gaze was cool, weighted with unspoken law. Lord Virixthi, intended, stood nearby, face unreadable, hands clasped in the way of someone already claiming victory. He assumed she'd yield, like every royal before her, that she'd obey for the sake of the crown. But Kaelara didn't lower her eyes. She didn't recite the expected oath. Instead, she did the one thing that could not be undone. "I will not bind with Lord Virix," she said clearly, deliberately, not even glancing in his direction. "I request a human, one from Earth." The silence that followed didn't fall. It slammed. Gasps didn't trickle, they cracked the chamber like fault lines under glass. One ambassador dropped her scribe crystal. Another choked on a breath that refused to be civilized. The queen's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled around the edge of her throne with the precision of someone calculating the consequences of disobedience down to the atom. Still, Kaelara's voice didn't falter. Not for lust, not for novelty, not for political rebellion. She let her gaze move across the council like a blade. But because they feel, they fight for what they love, they risk their ruin for moments we can't even name. While we sit on thrones of memory and call it peace. But it's not peace. It's sedation, it's detachment. We've forgotten how to burn. No one moved. Even the orbital filters that normally hummed faintly had gone still, as if the entire planet held its breath with the council. A few nobles exchanged hushed whispers, voices full of venom and disbelief. Lord Virix narrowed his eyes, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing, because nothing he could say would have matched the weight of her defiance. This was not a mistake. This was not madness. This was a declaration. Not just a preference, but of war against the numbness of tradition. And in that moment, what they feared most wasn't the scandal. It wasn't Earth. It wasn't even Kaelara's will. What they feared truly, silently, deeply, was that she might be right. That something vital had gone extinct in them long ago. And maybe, just maybe, it still lived on Earth. They said Earth was loud, dirty, unremarkable. But no satellite, no probe, no whispered galactic record had ever captured what a human sounds like when he's singing to no one but the night. Dorian had forgotten what silence felt like. The city gray, rusted, and endlessly dripping pulse beneath him like a broken heart. Neon signs buzzed overhead with promises they never kept, while cold rain slid off the edge of his borrowed rooftop like the world itself was shrugging him off. He sat cross-legged on the concrete, cradling a weather-beaten guitar that had more cracks than color. His fingers moved by memory, not joy, not even hope, just necessity. A single chord rang out, then another, then something that might have been a melody, soft, aching, imperfect. He wasn't playing for an audience. Not anymore. That ended the day his scholarship disappeared, the same day his father's heart monitor went flat, and the world reminded him how small a human really was. He had degrees in systems no one funded anymore, knowledge of life beyond Earth that no one cared to believe. So now he poured drinks for strangers and sang only for ghosts. He didn't know the sky was listening. He didn't know that 72,000 light-years away, a frequency analysis crystal suspended in orbit over Lysith Prime had twitched, that the resonance of his voice had triggered a long-dormant archive. That his song had mapped perfectly onto a wavelength once used in pre-fall bonding rituals of frequency, now believed extinct, a frequency tied not to any instrument, but to a soul. He didn't know that Kaelara, the woman who had defied 1,000 years of royal bloodlines, had listened to the anonymous Earth broadcast and paused. Not because of the lyrics simple in broken English, but because of what lay behind it: grief, loneliness, longing without theatrics. She had heard symphonies sculpted from plasma winds and crystal percussion, but she had never heard anything so unapologetically real. Raw like open nerve endings, he sang as if each note might unravel him. And something in her, something quiet and danger, responded. On Earth, Dorian strummed through the final verse, not knowing he was no longer alone. Above the clouds, cloaked in orbit, a Lysithian listening vessel hovered silently, its scan complete. Target acquired. Vocal resonance confirmed. Emotional depth, anomalous. Soul frequency, exact match. Down below, Dorian coughed, tucked his guitar back into its ripped case, and muttered to himself like always. No one's listening anyway. He stood and disappeared into the flickering glow of a dead street lamp. But across stars, someone was. And that someone had just rewritten the fate of 2 civilizations with the brush of a whisper. No one remembered how the blackout started. There were no storms, no sirens, no warning. Just a sudden, suffocating collapse of light, like the city itself had blinked. Dorian had just stepped off the subway when it happened, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other gripping the frayed strap of his guitar case. The station flickered once. Then everything de-escalators, ads, even the buzzing fluorescence above. Silence fell in layers. And then, the humming started. It wasn't mechanical, not electrical either. It was too low for the human ear, but it pressed behind the eyes like a memory you didn't ask for. He turned instinctively, sensing motion in the dark. But all he caught was a shimmer, like heat waves on metal. And then he wasn't standing anymore. He wasn't anywhere anymore. He woke up upside down, though gravity no longer had the decency to explain which way was down. Light pulsed in soft spirals above him, unfamiliar constellations of pale green and violet rotating across the walls, like a breathing system made of stars. The chamber was quiet, sterile, humming softly its floor, invisible beneath a translucent field that kept his body floating 3 feet above nothing. His first breath was too shallow. The second was a gasp. His wrists were bound in magnetic cuffs that didn't hurt but also didn't yield. His mouth was dry, tongue thick with panic. He tried to shout, but the air around him swallowed sound like a desert swallowing footprints. Then the door opened. Not with a hiss. Not with menace. Just silence. And the arrival of something not entirely humanoid. Her robes didn't flow. They hovered. Her skin wasn't skin. It shimmered like glass dipped in the shimmer of dying stars. She didn't walk, she drifted forward with the confidence of someone who'd never known what it meant to fall. Dorian flinched as she approached, but she didn't touch him. She simply spoke. "You are safe, Dorian Kess." His name on her lips froze the panic in his throat. He stared at her, every thought screaming, "This is a dream. This is a hallucination. I hit my head. I'm in a coma. This isn't real." "I know you are confused," she said, her voice vibrating not in the air, but behind his ears. "But you were chosen, not captured. You are not a prisoner." He laughed. A broken, strangled sound. "Sure," he muttered. "I always dreamed of being kidnapped by an alien fashion icon." Her expression remained unreadable. "You are not a captive," she repeated calmly. "You are a candidate for interspecies pairing, selected by Her Highness Kaelara, first heir of Lysith Prime." His brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, a what now?" The woman tilted her head gently, as if studying an insect that had just insulted her ancestors. "You have been identified by bond, frequency resonance as compatible for royal alignment. Your voice matches the extinct harmony signature of the pre-fall era. Your biological patterns suggest exceptional neuroempathic receptivity. In short," she leaned closer, "you are the anomaly the stars predicted." Dorian blinked. "This is insane." "No," she replied softly. "It's prophecy." And the word hung in the air longer than it had any right to. He looked away, heart hammering, sweat trickling down his back in a place gravity still hadn't decided existed. Through the faint blur of panic, he tried to recall anything from his late-night readings in college. The ones about ancient alien rituals, forgotten DNA keys, music as a medium for universal synchronization. None of it prepared him for this. "I'm just a guy," he said hoarsely, "a guy with a broken guitar and no health insurance." She almost smiled. "That may be," she said, "but the universe disagrees." The restraints released, not with a snap, but a soft ripple, like water ceasing to hold shape. He fell gently, weight returning in stages, breath catching as his feet touched the floor. His knees buckled, but the floor softened to catch him. Everything about this place seemed designed to unsettle him kindly. He stood slowly, warily, eyes darting from the floating screens to the alien sigils that blinked across the curved walls like living veins. "What happens now?" Her eyes shimmered. "We take you to meet her." And somewhere deep inside him, beneath the fear, the denial, the sarcastic deflection, something quiet unfurled, something that had been cold for a long time. Curiosity, not just about her, but about what kind of being could hear a stranger's song across light years and decide that he was worth the risk. They didn't call it a test. They called it a right. Because on Lysith, things that could break you were never named honestly. They were dressed in ritual, cloaked in purpose, and handed to you with grace so no one had to admit they were afraid of what came next. Kaelara stood at the center of the Chamber of Echoes, bare-handed, unarmored, and unflinching. She had insisted the rite of synthegration be performed in the old Wayno, memory shielding, no psychic dampeners, no filtration runes. What she offered was raw, and what he gave back had to be the same. Dorian stood opposite her in silence, unsure if his legs were still his, unsure if the air he breathed wasn't just manufactured calm. There were no cables, no machines, just two people surrounded by quiet, in a chamber carved from crystal veins that pulsed like a nervous heart. He asked once more, just to be sure. "You're not going to plug wires into my brain or anything, right?" Her eyes didn't blink, but they softened. No wires, only truth. It began without warning. One breath in, and then gravity dissolved, not from the floor, but from memory. He was falling, not through space, through her. It started with light, then sound, then grief. Not his, hers. It hit like a wave under his ribs. It wasn't the sharp, violent grief of a moment. It was the slow kind, the ancient kind. The kind you wear for years and forget is still there until someone touches the bruise. She'd been alone far longer than anyone realized. 1,000 advisors, a council of architects, a throne so old it hummed in 3 harmonics and, yet not one soul who truly saw her. Not until him. He gasped, and suddenly the world flipped. She was in his memory now. Dark apartment, rain against the window, father's voice on the answering machine, breaking in the middle of a sentence that would never be finished. Music echoing through empty rooms like a ghost looking for its body. She saw it, and she didn't turn away. One by one, the memories passed between them like flickers of old film. Her training mercilessly elegant, his failures painfully human. Her moments of rebellion, quiet and precise. His moments of shame, loud and messy. And then something shifted. They both landed in the same space. A shared memory that never existed, but felt like it always had. A balcony neither had seen. Stars neither had named. A song neither remembered writing, but both began humming at the same time. She looked at him not as a specimen, not as a symbol, not as a variable in her defiance, but as a man who had suffered and still sang anyway. And he looked at her not as a monarch, not as an alien, not even as the woman who pulled him across the stars, but as someone who was tired of being untouched. In the silence between the shared thoughts, something else bloomed. Not love. Not yet. Something older, something quieter. Recognition. When they came back eyes open, breath caught mid-word, neither spoke first. Dorian rubbed the back of his neck, heart hammering against something he didn't have a name for. Kaelara looked away for the first time since they met, her throat tight, her pulse audible in the delicate membranes near her jawline. He managed a whisper. That wasn't just a memory share. She nodded slowly. Number, it wasn't. He searched her face. What was it? Her voice was almost too soft to hear. It was the beginning. Outside the chamber, the room of observers remained quiet. Too quiet. Advisors looked at each other with unease. Elder delegates conferred in low tones. And among them, cloaked and still, Velcor watched. No screens could capture the full resonance of what had just occurred. But he didn't need data. He knew what he saw. A bond had formed. Unforced. Undistorted. And that was a threat. Because if two minds from different species could meet in truth without armor, without violence, without calculation, then the entire empire built on hierarchy and fear would crumble. It didn't happen in a war room. It didn't need weapons, nor blood, nor walls of fire. It happened under petals that glowed with bioluminescent light deep in the Garden of Stars, where the air always smelled of memory, and the flowers bloomed in rhythms tied to ancient pulse beacons. It happened in silence. And in silk, Lady Thessa moved like someone born in secrets. Not a step wasted, not a glance misplaced. She had served the crown through 5 reigns and outlasted 3 assassins. Her loyalty was measured not in words but in strategy. And tonight, her loyalty changed direction. She reached the edge of the garden where the gate shimmered faintly against the tree liney, an old telepathic relay nexus, long abandoned and buried beneath ceremonial vines. She pressed one hand against the root vein, whispered an authentication code that hadn't been spoken aloud since before Kaelara was born, and waited. A red glyph blinked once in her mind. Connection confirmed. No words were spoken. They weren't needed. The data packet pulsed from her hand-Earth's orbital defense network, lunar shield harmonics, human fleet latency, everything Lysith would need to strike before Earth could breathe twice. She didn't look back. But she felt the betrayal burning in her lungs anyway. Back inside the palace of Velithera, the queen stood by the obsidian mirror wall, watching not reflections, but simulations fragments of possible futures encoded in light and probability. Her face remained carved in sovereign neutrality, but her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve slowly, rhythmically, like a clock counting down. Lady Thessa entered without being called. No bow, no preamble. Your daughter no longer seeks alliance, she said, each word precise, as if afraid to waste even a syllable. She seeks extinction of our line, through emotional infiltration, genetic compromise. The queen did not flinch. She simply turned her gaze from the mirror to her advisor. Have you evidence? Her actions are the evidence, Thessa replied, a rite of synthegration, raw and unmoderated, emotional enmeshment with an unvetted human. Public empathy rituals, defiance of the Spire Council. If she succeeds, others will follow. The old ways will rot. The queen said nothing. But her silence was not ignorance. It was inheritance. A Lysithian monarch does not scream. A Lysithian monarch decides. And in that decision, kingdoms shift. She nodded once. Not permission, but absence of denial, and that was all Thessa needed. Far above, in the orbital shadow of the third moon, a vessel darker than vacuum itself absorbed the signal. On board, Velcor reviewed the stream without blinking. He had no anger left, only purpose. Initiate phase 1, he said coldly. We erase Earth before it embeds. No applause, no cheer. Just a row of cold operatives bowing in sync. They did not ask why. Because to them, Earth wasn't a threat. It was a disease. And Kaelara was the symptom. Meanwhile, unaware of the string tightening around her world, Kaelara walked the upper gardens, barefoot, alone, humming a half-remembered chord from Dorian's song. It lingered on her tongue like a forbidden words, oft, mortal, utterly beautiful. She didn't know who was watching, didn't know how close betrayal now breathed. But she paused by the edge of the garden, hand drifting through a beam of starlight as if tasting it, and whispered to no one, if this ends me, let it end something worth dying for. It didn't come with a declaration. No demands, no countdown, no blinking red on a shared diplomatic channel. Just silence. And then them. Velcor's fleet broke orbit like teeth-piercing, soft-skinned 12 dark friction cruisers cloaked in quantum dampeners, dropping through Earth's upper atmosphere like gods stripped of mercy. They didn't target cities. They didn't aim for power grids or communication hubs. They aimed for one man, one anomaly, one frequency that dared resonate outside its caste. Dorian Kess. From Washington to Munich to the orbital citadel and geostationary lock over the Pacific, human satellites lit up with impossible telemetry. Velcor's ships weren't tagged. They weren't on any known registry. Their tech defied known heat signatures, and yet they moved with military precision, quiet, fast, surgical. But they forgot where they were. They forgot Earth wasn't sleeping anymore. In the ice-sealed archives of Geneva, buried beneath 7 miles of concrete in denial, a signal awakened. Sentinel Protocol 9. A defense construct older than the cities it guarded, coded not in language but in conviction. And for the first time in 4 centuries, it spoke again. Threat origin, extragalactic. Objective, singular termination. Response, total counterforce authorized. No human pressed a button. The system was never meant to ask permission. Earth's wrath didn't arrive in missiles or pilots. It came in patterns, in bursts of electromagnetic pulses shaped like storm fronts, in quantum null compression bombs that folded time into ash. Velcor's fleet blinked, and in the next second, 6 of his cruisers were gone, not destroyed, erased, removed from space-time like they'd never existed. Screams didn't have time to form. On board the flagship Vorak Theta, Velcor watched half his command vanish through a haze of firelight and collapsing data. The silence from his second-in-command told him more than telemetry ever could. "How?" the helmsman whispered. "They're only human." Velcor didn't answer. Because he didn't understand either. Because deep in his engineered bones, where no emotion should live, something cold and undeniable bloomed. Fear. Down on Earth, in a music hall that hadn't seen applause in decades, Dorian stood frozen, guitar case still slung over his shoulder. He'd been walking home, just walking. Now the sky above cracked like glass. Flashes. Then silence. Then something that felt like the end of the world, and wasn't. He didn't know what just saved him. But he knew who they were aiming for. And something in him, the same thing that made him stay up late to play music into a city that never listened, snapped. He didn't run. He whispered to himself, "You came all this way to erase a song?" By the time Velcor tried to retreat, it was already too late. Sentinel Protocol didn't negotiate. It remembered. It remembered the war Earth almost didn't survive. It remembered the empires that came before. It remembered how close humanity came to surrendering its soul. And it never forgot the lesson. If you aim for one of us, you answer to all of us. Velcor's last transmission dissolved in static. The sky cleared, and the stars returned. But Earth would not forget. Nor would Kaelara, who watched it all from a silent relay on Lysith's edge. Her hand trembled not with fear, but with something older. Awe, not at destruction, but at what Dorian's existence had proven. They weren't just resilient, they were ready. There are moments that don't echo. They detonate. And in the throne hall of Lysith Prime, time broke into shards the second her mother spoke. Reject the human, or lose the crown. No rage, no trembling voice, just the sentence polished like obsidian and just as final. Kaelara didn't flinch. She didn't ask for time. She didn't request the chamber be cleared. She didn't bow. She looked her mother in the eye and, for the first time, saw not a queen, but a woman who had surrendered so many parts of herself to preserve a line that no longer breathed. And she smiled. Not with mockery, but with peace. "Then I abdicate." The council gasped as if she had struck them all with the same hand. But she wasn't looking at them. She was already walking away. Her footfalls echoed like a funeral rhythm across the starstone, floor measured, unapologetic, irreversible. In the hangar, they tried to stop her. Protocol enforcers, political aides. Even the head of royal security stepped forward with a tremor in his voice. "Princess, this is not the way." She didn't slow. "That title no longer belongs to me," she said. "And if this isn't the way, then perhaps the path was wrong." She boarded the vessel herself, no crew, no escort. Just her. Just the hum of a ship too royal to flee and too old to ask questions. In her quarters, she stood by the viewport as Lysith shrank behind Harrots, rings glowing like wedding bands she'd never wear. Her fingers curled around the edge of the glass, but her eyes didn't blur. She thought she might cry, but she didn't, because what she felt wasn't loss. It was relief. For the first time, she wasn't defending a title, or a bloodline, or a history written in treaties and fear. She was choosing something that didn't exist yet. Something fragile. Something human. Her thoughts drifted to Dorian, to the moment they touched minds, or the dreams they shared, or even the song that pulled her toward his world, but to the quiet after. The stillness when neither of them spoke. That silence where fear could have grown, but didn't. That was what she was protecting now. Not romance, not rebellion. Possibility. And possibility, she knew, had always been Lysith's greatest enemy. As Earth rose ahead, blue and pulsing with contradiction, Kaelara stepped toward the console. Her voice was calm. Open a diplomatic channel. Target, Planetary Defense Authority, Earth. A pause. Then static. Then connection. This is Kaelara of Lysith, formerly of the Crown. I come without army or claim, only choice, my own. I am en route. I seek no power, only permission to speak to the man your world nearly died to protect. She paused, then whispered, tell him I'm coming, and I'm not sorry. No one had ever landed there alone before. The lunar forum was rebuilt to host alliances, not confessions. It was designed for nations, not hearts. And yet there she was, one ship, no escort, no weapons. No shield, but truth. Kaelara stepped down onto the marble-like stone, the windless gravity of the moon brushing her cloak just enough to remind her this was no longer her world. This was his. And every sensor, every drone, every hidden eye from orbit to underground bunkers knew she was unarmed, knew she came not to claim, but to speak. But protocol still demanded silence. So the delegates waited. Earth's leaders, flanked by their military ghosts, stood without blinking. The scars of the last attempt on their soil still burned fresh behind their eyes. Kaelara didn't bow. She knelt, not as surrender, but as clarity. I am not here to take, she said, her voice steady, audible across every transmission in every known language. I am here to belong. No one moved. No one breathed. And then behind her footsteps, Dorian. He didn't walk like a politician. He didn't carry himself like someone chosen. He walked like someone still in shock, still unsure whether this was real or madness or a dream he hadn't woken from. But when he reached her, he didn't ask questions. He took her hand. No speech. No theatrics. Just fingers, laced like roots, finally finding Earth. The world watched. All of it. From jungle outposts to desert colonies, from cityscapes rebuilt from ash to orbital families pressed against display glass, they saw what no treaty ever showed. A Lysithian. A human. No war, no conquest. Only something quiet. In the silence that followed, politicians leaned into whispers. News anchors hesitated. Children pointed. And somewhere in the ruins of an old conservatory, a street musician plucked the first notes of a melody, unaware that Kaelara had once dreamed to it across galaxies. The song spread, first in one city, then another, then all of them. Not anthem, but reminder. That emotion wasn't weakness. That love didn't belong to one species. And that maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't made by empires, but by moments like this. No war ended that day. No crown was returned. No anthem played. But something began. And that was enough. Months had passed since the night Earth lit up its sky to defend a single name. Since Kaelara crossed 1,000 years of tradition and chose not power, but presence. Now the human Lysith cultural accord stretched across language, orbit, and fear. Trade routes opened, but not just for minerals or data. They exchanged music. Lysithian crystal instruments unplayable by AI, but perfectly tuned to human fingertips, became the bridge between frequencies. Earth offered folk songs, street symphonies, garage band rebellion. Lysith responded with soundscapes sculpted from starlight and memory. And both listened. For the first time in memory, they listened. The wedding wasn't broadcast across galaxies. There were no gold-plated dignitaries. No plasma gown processions. Just a small clearing in Central Park, beneath a willow older than the war that once nearly erased New York. It bent low like it was listening. A simple arch. A few guests, some human, some not. And no crowns. Kaelara wore white. Not Lysithian ceremonial silver, just linen, earth-made, wrinkled in the wrong places, imperfectly tailored, and absolutely hers. Dorian wore the same jacket he'd played guitar in on the night she heard him sing through space. And under that tree, with the world watching but not interrupting, they said their vows. Not in legalese. Not in royal dialects. But in truth, she looked into eyes that had faced extinction, shame, loss, and never stopped singing. You saw me when no one dared to look. He took her hand not like a prize, but like a promise. You stayed when others ran. No rings. No throne. Just a silence afterward that hummed with hope. Later that night, under the soft buzz of fireflies and low-orbit satellites, they danced barefoot in the grass. Someone played an old Earth love song through a speaker that crackled every few notes. Kaelara laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was real. She'd spent her life surrounded by perfect, things-precise architecture, flawless dialect, controlled futures. But this was the first time she felt alive. Not as a ruler, not as a bridge between empires, but as a woman whose heart had finally stopped whispering and started singing back. And somewhere deep in the Garden of Old Stars, far from the willow, far from the music, Lysith watched. And it remembered her silence, her abdication, her choice. And even insolent, proud ancient Thad to admit, it had never seen peace begin this way. She walked away from a throne to stand barefoot under a tree, not to claim a world, but to give both worlds a reason to believe again. When a Lysithian princess knelt before Earth's leaders, the galaxy watched in silence. But no one expected what came after. Not ceremony, not diplomacy, but a vow whispered beneath a willow tree that shattered 1,000 years of history. This wasn't a love story. It was a revolution wrapped in skin and song. And when she said, "You saw me when no one dared to look," even the stars stopped to listen. Stay with us, because this is how peace actually begins.